what I'm going to present to you today is a work in progress. And first, it's about linguistic enactivism. And first, what is linguistic enactivism? It is a theory of cognition that expands and deepens enactivism and offers a fully embodied and fully social treatment of human language. Well, it was presented in this book, Linguistic Bodies, by the authors Ezequiel Di Paulo, Elena Cufari, and Hanne de Jager. And in this talk, I am going to first highlight the main difference, the main methodological difference between linguistic enactivism and embodied cognition. And then I'm going to explore a little how we can investigate language under this new paradigm offered by linguistic enactivism. And I'm going to propose, it would be great to hear your opinion on that. I'm going to propose that situated composition and dance improvisation can be a good way for us to explore the workings of language. So first, the paradigm that language is embodied. Johnson, in a recent paper called The Embodiment of Language, mentions several basic components that a theory of embodiment has to offer, and he gives several examples of ways in which the theory that language is embodied that there is evidence for this theory, right? And I'm just mentioning a few here just for illustration purposes. So one is the idea that there are organism and environment interactions, and that meaning arises from these interactions. So you have there the notion of affordances that is very important, and also the constitution of the body of the organism that gives the organism the possibilities, right, for action. You have evidence, empirical evidence on body part projections, that we project the fact that we have a front and we have a back, that we project this body constitution into the objects that we interact with and into the objects that we create as well. And it would be different if we were like if we had a shape like a ball and not a front at all. There is the understanding that some concepts are perceptual concepts. So perceiving a chair involves a sensory motor, affective simulations of several possible experiences with chairs. Also the embodiment of abstract concepts and the theory of conceptual metaphors, which is basically the idea that all our abstract concepts are ultimately rooted in our bodily experience. There is also a lot of empirical evidence about this as well that I'm not gonna go into here, but just for illustration. So the point here is that the minimal unit of analysis for any cognitive process in this paradigm that language is embodied is the dynamic coupling of the agent with the environment. This is an important point. What linguistic enactivism proposes is that we change the way we think about bodies. We, instead of thinking about the body as playing as a role of universal constraint, right? As something that explains aspects of how we use and understand language, right? Instead of conceiving the body as like somewhere where language is instituted, we should change this view to a view in which we think about bodies as in language. So it's not anymore the idea that we have language as a thing, as a phenomenon, and it depends constitutively on the body. It's instead the idea that as bodies that we are from birth languaged. Even if we cannot verbally speak, for example, we are just from the beginnings in language. And this idea is the idea that language is a dynamic interactive practice. So it's not the idea of language as this set of rules and this kind of detached view, right? And much of what they develop in their theory is based on the fact that infants are fully engaged in participation with adults and children in linguistic interactions from birth, and they have even research on fetus and the interaction between the fetus and the mother. So the new paradigm is this: bodies are enlanguaged, and in this paradigm, the minimal unit of analysis of any cognitive act is the intersubjective relation of the agent with others. And of course, it is constrained by the environment, right? So there is a lot of overlapping with much of what is methodological difference. And this conception implies that the best way to investigate language is on social interactions. And this is a quote. I'm not going to go through it. It's just to register it here. The idea that linguistic bodies are enacted as practices of participatory sense-making. And there are two concepts that are very important in this theory. One is the participatory sense-making, and the other one is the concept of utterance. And I am going to mention them because they are important for my purpose in the end, to make clear. So the notion of participatory sense-making is the idea that sense-making happens in the context of a social interaction as it is affected by coordination patterns, breakdowns, and recoveries undergone during social encounters. So it's based on the more basic concept of sense-making. You have a quote there, but it is the sense-making that happens in social interaction. And the pillars for investigating this notion of participatory sense-making, as it is proposed by de Jager in a paper of her and with Di Paolo, and in a video that she presents the paper, it's actually the quote here on the bottom of the slide is just wrong. I'm just so it's a paper from 2007, if I'm correct. It's that one of the pillars is that we should look at what happens between people when they interact and counter interact, right? And we change then under this view, we change the conception of the subjects that are involved in the interaction. They are not anymore, they don't contain something. They are not something that is their thinking or projecting. You just don't investigate that as a unit. You investigate as part of a whole setting. And some examples of tools for investigate that empirically are dynamic systems theory and dual scanning neuroscience, for example. These are examples that she mentions. The other important point is that the interactive language as an interactive practice is structured by utterance production and utterance reporting. And this is important here. Utterance in this context is not any verbal or propositional or, sentence related thing necessarily. It can be, right? But the definition is that utterance is a dialogic act enacted asymmetrically through the actions of a mutually recognized producer and audience. So it doesn't have to be verbal. It is any act that is performed by someone and it is recognized by someone else. So I start there. This is where I start my proposal. I start from the paradigm of that bodies are enlanguaged, and I'm interested in exploring the ways in which, how the ways in which we interact will give us insights on the workings of language. So I take that for granted, right? That the ways in which we interact will give us insights on the workings of language. Okay, if I accept that most of our non-lexical actions are linguistic, as you just saw, based on the notion of utterance, if I accept that social interactions are the best settings to investigate language, as it is in according to the notion of participatory sense-making, and I bring Wittgenstein now, that it's good to start investigating simple cases, as he says that in philosophical investigations, that it disperses the fog if we study the phenomena of language in primitive kinds of use, in which one can clearly survey the purpose and functioning of the words. And here, Wittgenstein, of course, says words, but I'm substituting that notion by utterance, right? Because it's not necessarily a verbal word that I'm considering here. And I think this applies very well to these cases as well. So I'm taking this Wittgensteinian view that it's good to investigate simple cases because it disperses the fog of very complex phenomena. So of course, we have to study them as well, but it's good to start with the simple ones. Then I can get to the conclusion that we can look for aspects of participation in any kind of interaction, right? Given Wittgenstein, the simpler ones are better. Now, my proposal is that we consider situated composition and dense improvisation as a source for exploring the workings of language. This is a picture of an improvisation that happened online, right? This is not ideal, but it's the condition we are now under this pandemic situation, in which we explore some aspects of the interaction there. Just as I'm just gonna offer you a very simple definition of what is dense improvisation. Dense improvisation is the process of spontaneously creating movement. When you think about that in situated composition, you were thinking about people interacting and composing together, right? Right, why this? And here I'm going to give you some specificities of situated composition or dense improvisation. First, it involves high levels of explorations of interactions, which may make it more clear to us what is involved in the significance that emerges from utterances. Just a reminding that utterances are acts, right? Well, some features. It is non-verbal in most cases. It can include some verbal actions, but mostly non-verbal. It involves advanced, highly trained linguistic bodies. Why is that relevant? Because much of what is offered as good examples to show for the aspects that we should consider, for example, time, for example, rhythm, and these things are examples of developmental psychology in the book, in the Linguistic Bodies book. So this would be a setting that is not a case of developmental psychology. Another important point is that it's not on any of the other contexts specific for investigating language as a specific phenomenon. So it breaks with the idea that we have something there, language, that we want to investigate in a certain setting. And then we take that as specific phenomenon, and then we see how communication is happening and this thing. It breaks with that. It takes language as a general part of any interaction, and communication there in these settings is not the main aim. And also, it is not everyday task related. So it's not a means to anything. It is an end in itself. It is an activity that is an end in itself. So it could, in principle, be free of specific constraints of daily life activities, although it has its own constraints. Well, why would that be relevant to be free of everyday constraints if it has its own? Because, and I bring Wittgenstein again, many times the aspects of things that are most important for us are hidden because of their simplicity and familiarity. So many times we don't pay attention to things that are important, to aspects that are important, because they are so, they are so obviously there, right? So the situated composition or dance improvisation would be a good scenario, good context for us to be able to have a better view on what are the constraints that are there.
Nara, sorry, 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm gonna give you here some reasons now. I just gave you some specificities of this kind of practice, and I'm gonna give you some reasons for investigating situated composition and dance improvisation. Well, first of all, it is a dialogic act, right? It is a social interaction. It doesn't involve all the complexities of lexical interactions, as I mentioned as a feature of that in the previous slide. It can be analyzed also by means of observable objective elements. And here I bring an example of motion capture of the human body. It's a research, this is just illustrative, but it's the idea that there are many objective elements that can be isolated there, like weight, strength, time, space, proportions, fluidity, content. There are lots of stuff. And then one can say, well, but this is not all, right? We cannot reduce the interaction to this to the very movements and the relations between people in this movement way. No, one very specific concern of enactivism is exactly to consider several aspects, and the experience of the participants is also very relevant for us to understand things, to understand what's happening there. And also it can be done using double, triple scanning. There are several things that can be added to these settings. It shows important similarities with the concepts proposed by linguistic enactivism. I'm just going to mention one example, which is what I call imitation, contrast, and novelty, are kinds of improvisation or participation. These are concepts that were presented and explored by Professor Moraes as kinds of systemic connections. And this concept of imitation is one example of how it can be associated to the notions of incarnation and incorporation that are offered by the linguistic bodies theory. And then, this is my bet now, that kinds of participation first identified in improvisation can be further explored in lexical interactions. So the idea is that we take several concepts and all the way the theory of linguistic bodies is organized to offer us some conceptual tools to understand language. And then we look at the scenarios, right? We look at the improvisation, the situated composition and dance improvisation. And then we try to identify these things. And in looking at that, we're gonna see more things as well. There are some specificities that are already identified there. And as soon as we notice this thing, we can just, okay, now let's see if this also applies to verbal language, if this can be also identified in verbal language. So this is how I think it is an interesting way, how situated composition and then improvisation is an interesting way for us to gain insights on the workings of language. This is just an example of a show that was presented at Push International Performing Arts Festival. It is a company from Canada. It's called Luplu. And what is very interesting and very specific of this show is that it explores concepts of looping and transformation and how inevitable conflicts, inconsistencies leads to both the disintegration and the emergence of something new. So you can see there the fact that bodies are in constant negotiation, that they are coping with change together. These are all aspects that are offered by linguistic enactivism for us to understand language as well. And this show has this specific feature of having this as a name, having this change in the reconstruction as a name of the very interaction of the participants. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Nara. Jefferson?
Thank you, Nara. Was excellent as I was expecting, because I have two questions, I think, that are more related to linguistic bodies and not about your proposal with using dance as a case study. One problem that I had with the book and the proposal, to me, I don't understand the scope quite well, because I'm going to use an example. During one of the talks in this afternoon, my cat was in my lap, and she was moving her head because she wanted me to pet her. Mm-hmm. That is an utterance. I mean, there is a form of participatory sense-making between two agents acting together in the environment. If the answer is yes, this does not trivialize a little bit, because then all interaction between animals and human beings, all interaction involving animals will be linguistic. Is that maybe too general of a proposal? And I forgot the second one. When I remember, I will, if you have time.
Okay, thank you, Jefferson. Well, it's an interesting concern if it wouldn't mean to trivialize language, but I think well, one would have to present a good argument to say, well, this is not trivializing, but the way I think when I think about answering this question, and this is not a problem for the linguistic enactivism, because they claim that this sense making is there already in the most basic forms of cognition. So there's the continuity between life and language. So every living system is sense making able. If I can say that. So I think they start from that. They start, well, everything, when you have two living organisms, they interact, they even, I don't want to use the word information, because I don't want to, but if you use the word information in this very, what's the word for that? With this very deflated way, you have sense making there. You have trees changing information about in their roots about, I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly what was the case for that, but the idea that trees communicate through their roots regarding when some animal eats them, and then they start producing more defenses. So the other one also starts producing more defenses. So this is already a kind of sense making. I don't think they would have a problem with that.
My counter argument very quickly, they make a strong, they seem to make a strong distinction between sense making in general and participatory sense making. The first 4 chapters of the book are about sense making, and then they introduce the idea of participatory sense making. So it seems relevant at some point to make a difference. And again, it's a question of scope when I draw the line. Or
yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, with participatory sense making, it comes also the autonomy of social interactions, right? So when you don't have that, you don't have participatory sense making. I would, if I wanted to draw a line, I would go in this direction, but I would have to think more about that before I commit myself a little further.
We have a question from Felipe.
Yeah, so hi, Nara. Thanks for the presentation. I had a question that was similar to Jefferson about verbal and non-verbal behavior and this sort of things, but I think you pretty much answered it. So I'm going to ask another one. I'm trying to understand like linguistic enactivism, this just new way of understanding linguistic phenomena, just in comparison to how more traditional philosophy of language used to study this phenomenon, to see if these two things are commensurable in some way, or it's just like we should just drop everything, throw away everything and start anew. So philosophers were interested in these sort of distinctions, like have like in speech act theory, have like locutionary acts and illocutionary acts and perlocutionary acts. So distinctions between the words, the actual words used and their meaning, or what the intended meaning, the speaker's meaning, intended meaning of these words, and the effect that these words cause on the person. So in linguistic enactivism, we just say like, no, that's just we don't care about making the distinctions. We just completely different way of understanding these things, or we still want to make similar distinctions between the words people use and the effects that they have on the world. So what is the relation between these two ways of doing philosophy of language?
I would say that no, it's not the case that we should throw everything away and start from scratch. There is a lot of examples. There are a lot of examples in the book that they recover some specificities of theories of language and explanations of language that are that work in the old paradigm, and they say, well, in this case, this person identified this, and this is aligned with our view. So this could be explored a little further to be in accordance to a linguistic enactivist perspective. So I think much of what we do in current research in linguistics can be so we have to look at the specificities, right? But they can be adapted, right? We are going to maybe give up of some things, and we're going to change some things, but many things are going to just be adapted to if you wanna right, develop the theory of linguistic bodies, and then and see how it is different and how it is similar to what was proposed before. So even working in minimal content. What is the expression? The minimalist view on content. I think even that can be compatible, because linguistic enactivism is questioning the very basis of cognition and how language is part of us. But of course, they're not going to say that very specific logic systems are not right because they don't contemplate the nature of how things are. No, they are just going to say, well, they work in this context. This is a form of participatory sense making. It makes sense in this context, and it is useful for some end, and right. So I think the main point are going to be the strong claims about the nature of language, and that is something that they would give up. They would say, well, this is totally it's something that we want to avoid, the strong claims about language and how our brain represents, or so they would just avoid this. They would change this to a different view, but many things are going to be adapted, I think.
I'm sorry we don't have more time, but both Mariana and Itamar made questions in the chat, so maybe you could answer them there. But thanks again, Nara.
Thank you.